Hi, and thank you for tuning into my talk. I will briefly tell you about our study where we looked at merging eddy covariance and remote sensing models to monitor agricultural greenhouse gas budget. This study is a collaboration with the University of Wisconsin, the US Dairy Forage Research Center, and Stefan Metzger from NEON. A recent study found that the top 20 meat and dairy producers worldwide, of which about half are in the US, together produce more emissions compared to my home country Germany alone. And worse, these emissions are projected to increase even further in the future. Traditionally, farm greenhouse gas budgets only include emissions per pounds of milk produced, where emissions originate from management, enteric fermentation, electricity, as well as imports of feed and fertilizer. However, this often ignores the role that farm vegetation plays in mitigating some or all emissions by taking up CO2 from the atmosphere. These offsets from plant productivity and management are called natural climate solutions or nature-based solutions. They are defined as actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges while simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. One objective of this research is to improve greenhouse gas budget calculations for dairy farms and other agricultural systems by accounting for these natural climate solutions. However, measuring every single flux is time-consuming and expensive, and worse, there's large uncertainty of the effect size of natural climate solutions, as you can see in the error bars in this figure from Fargione et al. In 2018, here zoomed into agricultural systems. This is because soil carbon sequestration can be spatially and temporally very variable because it depends on a lot of factors like climate and soil type. For example, we know that cover crops and biochar have climate benefits, but the effect size of each can vary quite a bit. Remote sensing products can help simplify the process and decrease the uncertainty related to these measurements, and the information could help producers increase their profits through credits for sustainable farm practices, and implementing these natural climate solutions can also help improve water quality and build farm resilience. Despite the recent upticks in the adoption of better soil health practices, there's actually very few farms that implement no-till or cover crops to date. So to increase the adoption of more sustainable practices, we need techniques that can decrease the uncertainty related to these solutions so that more people will adopt these practices. So here we tested if the combination of eddy covariance and remote sensing techniques could be used to improve natural climate solutions monitoring, specifically carbon accumulation from plant productivity in agro-ecosystems by overcoming limitations of spatial and temporal resolution via remote sensing and financial costs via eddy covariance. So we are here particularly interested in if we can use eddy covariance to monitor natural climate solutions in agro-ecosystems, particularly while accounting for the spatial heterogeneity of these systems, which would normally violate a basic assumption of the eddy covariance methodology. And if we can use results from the eddy covariance product to improve remote sensing models that can be used to upscale these solutions regionally. We are also interested in estimating the annual and daily greenhouse gas budgets for the US Dairy Forage Research Center farm. So this farm is located in Prairie du Sac, Wisconsin. This is a working dairy farm on 890 hectares of land. The herd includes approximately 350 milking cows and 300 heifers and dry cows, and the farm grows alfalfa and corn, soybeans, winter wheat, and has recently started to include cover crops as well. Additionally, a large proportion of the farm is perennial vegetation of shrubs and grasslands and forests and pastures. And in the picture on the left, you can see the location of our eddy covariance tower and the average footprint for the last 2 years. So I'll quickly run through the methods that we used here. So first, we calculated farm productivity using a remote sensing model for GPP and RECO, so gross primary productivity and ecosystem respiration from Zhao and Gao et al. The model uses spectral indices from satellite data, in this case Landsat, such as Enhanced Vegetation Index, Land Surface Water Index, and Land Surface Temperature, as well as photosynthetic active radiation measured at the tower. It also uses maximum quantum yield, which is the amount of carbon a plant species can take up per amount of photosynthetic active radiation received. So for the initial runs, we use average values from the literature for each crop and vegetation type. Then we ran the high frequency eddy covariance data as well as the spatial information through the ERF approach, which is the environmental response function approach that was developed by Stefan Metzger. It accounts for the different contributions of each flux source based on the footprint characteristics as well as the spatial information that we fed it, which in this case were land surface temperature and enhanced vegetation index. The results are then fed into a machine learning approach which quantifies the importance and relationship of each driver to others. With that information, the code then extrapolates the fluxes spatially, even beyond the extent of the eddy covariance footprint, using the spatial information that we provided. The results are then spatial temporal maps of NEE of CO2 fluxes. In this case, we calculated these on an hourly timescale. We then extracted the mean and standard deviations for each field and vegetation type at the farm so that we obtained 70 NEE time series for the farm. These time series were then filtered and gap-filled using REDDYPROC, and then we extracted the parameter maximum quantum yield for each vegetation type, and the new average values for each vegetation type were then fed into the remote sensing model that we reran to estimate productivity again. To quantify if ERF improved remote sensing parameters, we compared the remote sensing model using literature values, the ERF approach alone, and the improved remote sensing model with harvest data that we obtained from fields at the farm, which we also converted to grams of carbon. In this graph on the left, I'm showing you the results for the improved remote sensing model. For this graph, I calculated the regression coefficients between the estimated carbon for all fields versus the field harvest data that we also converted to carbon. You see that using the literature maximum quantum yield data, we're actually pretty close to the harvest data already. The ERF approach is very similar with a slightly better fit, but then using the improved maximum quantum yield data and the new remote sensing model, we see an even closer prediction of the plant productivity and harvest biomass. And then on this graph, I'm just showing you the annual net primary productivity using the improved remote sensing model on the x-axis versus the harvest data. So you see the fit is pretty well. Each of these dots represents one field at the farm. In this can then be extrapolated on the spatial extent. So here you can see in the center that ERF is more seamless, which in a natural setting makes more sense as vegetation productivity will be influenced by neighboring vegetation rather than having these sharp borders that the remote sensing model predicted. Interestingly, all three models predicted a carbon budget of almost 0 for soybean fields, which could have huge implications as soybeans are often exported from farm settings and usually grown to obtain nitrogen credits for nutrient management plans. What we also see is that the forest maximum quantum yield was underpredicted and quite low when using the ERF, the new ERF maximum quantum yield data in the remote sensing model, which is likely a function of combining all forest types into one category here rather than separating it by age and species. So now we can estimate a full carbon budget for the farm, not only annually, but here shown on a daily timescale. So here are the daily results shown in kilograms, megagrams of CO2 per day for 2019, showing the MPP that was estimated using remote sensing models with the literature maximum quantum yield data in dark green, the eddy covariance ERF results in light green, and the improved remote sensing model with the maximum quantum yield data that we obtained from the eddy covariance results. And then in black, we have the total daily emissions estimated using feed and manure data following IPCC guidelines. You can see that there's a discrepancy between the remote sensing model and ERF. However, this is no surprise since satellite data in this case only observed the land during the daytime. So to have a fair comparison then, I only selected NEE data from the ERF approach from daytime, so when radiation was larger than 0, which now you can see matches pretty well in dark red here with the remote sensing models. That in turn means that the eddy covariance approach, the eddy covariance ERF approach has the advantage of also monitoring systems at night, such that we get a full picture of the carbon exchange of the system, including ecosystem respiration at night, which was ignored in the remote sensing models and thus led to an overestimation of carbon uptake by the farm. In reality, what you can see here is the total carbon accumulation of the farm was much lower when nighttime respiration was taken into account. So this is the total annual NEE budget that you see here. And now you can also see that relatively older alfalfa fields, such as the one 5100 in the center here, has a much lower carbon balance compared to pastures like this one, for example. And now finally, we can estimate a full greenhouse gas budget for the farm. Total emissions for 2019 were about 9.5 megagrams of CO2 in CO2 equivalent. When we accounted for the variability, the maximum emissions that we calculated were about 10.2 megagrams of CO2 equivalent. And you can see the remote sensing and ERF daytime models estimated between 30 to 40 megagrams of CO2, while the ERF approach, so using the eddy covariance data, included the nighttime data, and with that we estimated about 10.6 megagrams of CO2 in 2019. This is good news because this means that the farm was a carbon neutral for 2019. And additionally, because the farm has such a big extent of forest, shrublands, and grasslands, more than 60% of all the carbon that was taken up was actually contributed by forests, grasslands, and shrublands. So to conclude, then we found that ERF can monitor natural climate solutions while accounting for spatial heterogeneity of agri-ecosystems. We found that the eddy covariance remote sensing fusion products can help monitor farm greenhouse gas budgets by updating plant physiological parameters. The US Dairy Forage Research Center dairy farm was net zero in 2019, where the natural vegetation mitigated most of the emissions. And most importantly, the eddy covariance ERF approach allows to monitor ecosystems at night. So we're actually accounting for the respiration there as well. So thank you so much for listening. Of course, I'd like to thank all my funding sources, especially the Dairy Innovation Hub, who's funding my research right now, all my collaborators and the co-authors on this project. And I'd like to thank you for watching. And if you like to contact me, there's my email address and my Twitter handle, as well as my website. Thank you so much.